Hey guys, welcome back to Zane Customs. In this week's episode, we're going to be sculpting the skeleton from Minecraft. So as per usual, I started the sculpt off on my iPad, and I just went ahead and loaded up a basic human body preset, and then I'm going in and carving away at it to make it look more like bones and less like an actual body. And eventually I'll put it into ZBrush so I can cut holes out of it and make it look really hollow like a real skeleton, but here I'm just trying to get the basic shape down, going back and forth and remeshing till I get something I'm happy with. So the hardest part of this sculpt for me was probably the fingers and the head, and I always have a hard time with hands, so that's nothing new there, but the head gave me a lot of trouble because I want it to look like an actual skull, but also I want it to be a little bit more boxy and have the Minecraft nature in it. Like all the other sculpts I've done in this Minecraft series, I want it to look like a more realistic variant, but I'm not trying to go way too dark and gritty with it. I still want it to be a little lighthearted while still being more realistic. And that was a very fine line for me to toe with this one in particular. So one thing you'll notice is I'm not really cutting any material out. I'm just carving in lines where I'm going to want to cut material out, and that's because I'm using Forger, and Forger doesn't have that ability. But once I put it over to the computer, you'll see I'll start actually cutting good chunks of material out, like his eyes or his rib cage or his shins and forearms have two bones going through them, where like the thigh or the upper arm is just one solid bone. And like I said, I differentiate the two bones in the forearms by carving a line between them that you can see, but I can't actually cut a hole in between them because Forger doesn't allow that. But you'll see once I push it over to my computer, I'm able to do that. So a lot of what I had to do with this sculpt was try to toe the line between fantasy and realism. So obviously this looks more realistic than a Minecraft skeleton, but there's still a lot of fantastical elements behind it. There's a lot of bones in here that aren't real bones. The rib cage doesn't have the same amount of ribs as a real skeleton. The skeleton head is much bigger, much more boxy. There's even bones in here that don't exist in real life. And that's just something that, like I said, it's more of an artistic thing. I just went back and forth until I found something I was happy with. And while I'm doing a more realistic variant of the Minecraft skeleton, there's not a lot I can actually pull from the Minecraft skeleton. It's not super detailed model or anything, so I had to pull a lot from real life and real skeletons. But then again, I didn't want it to just be a real skeleton, because then what's the point? So I still kind of had to go back and forth between the two to make it something I was happy with. But now that I got it in ZBrush, I can go ahead and add a lot more detail. Again, ZBrush is such a powerful tool and way more powerful than Forger. So I'm able to smooth out a lot of the imperfections and add a lot more details and build up areas I wasn't able to before. And then eventually you'll see I'll go in and start cutting big chunks of the model out to give it more of a actual skeleton feel. And that's what I'm doing right here. I want the inside of his ribcage to be hollow, so I made a sphere to the size of what I wanted to be removed, and then I just cut the sphere away and it left that big hole. Then I did at the top, kind of right under his neck, and then I'm doing it to cut a hole from the front to the back, and you'll see me do it a lot. I do it right here in his pelvis. I end up doing some to his skull and some to his legs. It looks like a lot more of a realistic skeleton and more of an impressive sculpt in my opinion, and gives it more of that hollow look I was trying to go for. I try to leave the model in as basic a position as possible for sculpting purposes, because then I can have mirror symmetry on and it'll affect two sides at once. But it's not a very dynamic pose, and it's not a very fun sculpt in the end if it's just standing there. So eventually I had to go in and repose them. And for anyone that's played Minecraft, they know that skeletons have bow and arrows. So that's what I'm doing here, trying to get him in a pose where he's pulling back on a bow. And I'll just go in and I'll mask off what I don't want to move, and you can see that whatever's darker isn't going to move, whatever's lighter is going to move. And then there I just threw in the floor so I can get his feet both on the same plane. And with that, the skeleton's basically done. I can just go ahead and start working on the bow, the arrows, and the hands. So for the bow, I just pulled out a cylinder and stretched it and then started warping things here and there. And the Minecraft bow, again, it's all pixel art, but it's not very complex. So it didn't take too much to get it to look like a Minecraft bow, to be something I was happy with. And here I'm starting to work on his hands. And hands are always, for me at least, something that's very hard. It always takes me a long time. I always dread doing it. These particular hands were harder than any I've ever done because they're skeleton hands, so they got to look like bones, and they got to be thinner than normal. They got to have holes in between each finger. I mean, a normal hand, the top of it is all connected, but underneath the bones, they're not all connected. So you got gaps in between, and it was such a long, tedious process, and you'll see me go back and forth and start working on some other parts of the model just because I get burned out on it. This definitely was the hardest part of the sculpt for me. Even at this point, I got something that's like, you could tell what it's supposed to be, but some of the fingers are much longer than others, for the distance from one knuckle to another. And yeah, some fingers are longer. Your middle finger is longer than all the other ones, but it wasn't very realistic what I had going on here. Some of them were quite a bit longer, and you just had to work it back and forth and just keep going at it for quite a while before I got something I was happy with. Now here I'm putting in the string. I made the string pretty thick on here for printing purposes. I want to 3D print all these models and sell them on my Etsy, and you can't really make something as thin as actual string print well because it's going to be so brittle. So I made it quite a bit thicker, but I don't think it'll matter. And then I'll just paint it black and it'll look like string. And then here I'm doing the arrow, and with the arrows, they're super simple. It's just a cylinder and then a cone on top that I squashed and warped a little bit. And as you can see, I did a lot of work on the bow, kind of reposing it so that when the strings pulled back, it would be more symmetrical. But his hands aren't done. And that's just what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes I get so burned out on one thing, especially when it's not going well, that I'll hop onto something else. So here I'm working on his back, but eventually I'll go back in and work on his hands again. When you repose a model, it'll often stretch the model's geometry in weird ways, and that was actually very, very minor in this case because it's a skeleton and there was just small points that's going to pivot on. I don't have to worry about fabric or something that's going to get stretched weird or anything. This is actually probably the easiest model I've ever reposed, but there are still little things that I had to go in and fix, like you saw on his elbow there, and then some on the shoulders. I'll go back and forth to fix them up. So as I did the hands, I left them as separate models from the skeleton. They're not attached yet, and that's for the purpose of dynameshing. When you dynamesh, it reapplies an even layer of polygons across your whole model, which is perfect for this case where I started with a sphere and I'm trying to cut lines in between it to make them look like fingers. But I don't want to do that to the whole skeleton body because he's a pretty high poly count at this point, and if I go ahead and dynamesh it, it'll reapply an even layer of polygons across his body, but it'll bring it down to a specified layer of polygons, so it might soften a lot of the details or kind of dull it, and I don't want that to happen. So what I can do is just leave the hands separate and dynamesh it back and forth until I get what I'm happy with, and then once I'm happy with the hands, then I can actually attach it to the actual skeleton body. What I'm doing here is just duplicating the hand, moving it over and mirroring it for the right hand. And the position I had for the left hand, holding the bow kind of cockeyed, actually worked really, really well for how I wanted him to be pulling back the bowstring, because he's got 2 fingers farther forward and his thumbs coming to meet him, and it just ended up working really good. And here you can see I put a cylinder in there to cut some material out. That's what I'm talking about I'm doing for the rest of the body and the skull and all that. But yeah, this hand ended up working really well, and I was able to use it for both the right and left hand. And when I turned it into the right hand, I did modify it quite a bit and move the thumb up and some of the fingers around a little bit, but it was essentially the same hand to start with. And now that the hand's done, we're getting into my favorite part of modeling, where basically everything's completely modeled. I don't have to worry about weird geometry or anything like that. Everything's modeled and ready to go. Now I just get to go in and add any final details, any texturing. Like here I'm making the tip of the arrow, I'm trying to make it look more like flint, adding some string around the base of it, and there's some minor details like adjusting the thumb on his right hand there, but pretty much everything is modeled in its basic shape. I just got to go clean things up, clean up any jagged edges, cut some holes in his eyes. I end up adjusting his face too, to have his jaw hinging down to make it look more like he's yelling. That's just the funnest part of sculpting for me, just the final details and making it look really good, the tiny little artistic details. Like I said earlier, the forearms and chin bones are actually 2 bones, whereas the thigh is just 1. And on Forger I just carved a line in between to kind of show where I wanted that gap to be, but now using ZBrush I can actually go in and create that gap. And adding all these gaps and cutting into the actual skeleton body, I feel like really brought this sculpt to life. So after I added in the teeth, I noticed that the skeleton had a pretty blank expression and I wanted him to look more menacing. So what I did is I masked off his jaw and I ended up cutting it away and then filling in the holes and repositioning it to make it look like he was yelling. And then from there, I was able to re-merge it with the head and then blend back in his jaw back into his head to make it look like one sculpt. And it ended up working really well. I just wanted it to look like he was yelling, and it worked really well. The reason I did that is, if you have seen my previous sculpts of the Enderman, he's got a super blank expression on his face as well, but I feel like that kind of fits with the personality of the Enderman if you've played the games. The skeletons are always attacking you constantly. They'll walk out into the sun and burn themselves to death trying to kill you. So I wanted the skeleton to look a lot more aggressive than the Enderman. And now here I'm going in and painting, and for the base of this one I decided to go with snow. And I don't know if I'm going to stick with that. I wanted all my Minecraft bases to be able to connect and interlock and have different biomes for each base, but snow doesn't really fit the skeleton. There's other mobs that would be in the snow that make more sense, so I might end up changing that, but I just thought it'd be a fun base for now. And then here I'm going in and doing some lighting and rendering out some pictures. And before I get too far doing the pictures, I remembered that I had to scale him based off the size of some of my previous sculpts. So I pulled in the spider and the Enderman so I could size him based off that. And I wanted him to be small enough that I can do a variant of him riding the spider, to have a spider jockey. And I could have the standing skeleton and the one riding the spider be different, but I wanted them to be the same size because that's how they are in the game. So I brought both of them in so I could compare them, and I actually looked up a picture of an Enderman next to a skeleton, and an Enderman is almost twice the size. So in the end, the skeleton looked pretty small, but I think it's pretty accurate to the game. And then once I got that done, and the lighting how I wanted to, I went in, and that's what I'm doing here, just rendering some pictures for social media, and I'll put those pictures in here at the end. Alright, that's the finished sculpt. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe. And check out my Instagram, it's also at Zane Customs, as well as my Etsy. In my Etsy account, I sell sculpts of everything I've done here. I 3D print them, I glue them together, and you could either buy it as fully colored or fully primed variant if you want to color it yourself. But check that out if you're interested, and thanks for watching.